Here on the Deep Dive, we plunge into the heart of fascinating topics, trying to give you the real story fast. Today, we're unraveling one of history's most enduring enigmas, Atlantis. Just hearing that name, it conjures images, advanced civilizations, hidden cities beneath the waves, maybe a lost golden age. But the big question for us is it fact or is it, well, pure fiction?
It's a captivating thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this isn't just some simple mystery. It's a story layered with centuries, really, of human imagination.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the original source of the Atlantis story. We want to explore how its interpretations have wildly evolved through time and investigate the many, many attempts people have made to actually find this legendary island.
There have been quite a few.
Right. By the end, you'll hopefully have a clear, thorough understanding of why Atlantis holds such a powerful grip on our collective imagination and, crucially, what the actual evidence truly tells us. We've pulled from a really diverse stack of sources for this one, everything from Plato's ancient Greek dialogues to, cutting-edge modern geological research, and even a surprising array of contemporary cultural references.
It's quite remarkable, actually, how one ancient text, just one, has branched out into so many different fields of study and, well, belief systems, too.
Okay, let's get right into it then. When we talk about Atlantis, where does this sprawling legend actually begin? Because I think many people might not realize there's really only one primary source for the entire story.
Yeah, that's a crucial distinction right at the outset. The only primary sources for Atlantis are Plato's dialogues, Timaeus, and Critias. Every single other mention of this island, ancient or modern, directly stems from these two writings. It all goes back to Plato, period.
So we're talking about the famous Greek philosopher Plato. He wrote Timaeus around, 360 BC?
Yeah.
And then Critias followed. What's the narrative setup he creates for this incredible tale?
Well, it's quite clever. The dialogues claim to quote Solon, the revered Athenian statesman and lawgiver. The story suggests Solon visited Egypt. This would have been between 590 and 580 BC, and supposedly translated Egyptian records he found there about Atlantis.
So it's framed as this ancient wisdom passed down.
Exactly. It's a very smart literary device to lend authority, weight to the narrative he's weaving.
That's a masterful way to frame a story, isn't it? And what was Atlantis in Plato's telling? I mean, was it meant to be a real place, some lost continent just waiting to be found?
Well, this is where it gets really fascinating. Plato used Atlantis as a fictional island. It was serving as an allegory on the hubris of nations, you could say. It was a literary counter-image to the Achaemenid Empire of his own time.
The Persians.
Right, and it was designed to showcase the superiority of Plato's ideal state, very much like the one he detailed in his Republic. So he wasn't really documenting history. He was building a philosophical argument, a kind of thought experiment maybe, to illustrate the dangers of unchecked power and ambition.
So it wasn't just a story, but more like a mirror. Plato held up to his own society, highlighting the perils of arrogance and maybe militarism.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so how does he describe this powerful, ultimately ill-fated empire? Where did he say it was located?
Plato was actually quite specific on location. He put it beyond the Pillars of Hercules.
Which for the Greeks meant?
Mouth of the Mediterranean, essentially. So in the Atlantic Ocean. He described it as being huge, larger than ancient Libya and Asia Minor combined.
Wow.
Yeah. And in Critias, he even gives these precise dimensions for the Great Plain in the south. 3,000 stadia in one direction, that's about 555 kilometers, maybe 345 miles. And then across the center inland, 2,000 stadia, roughly 370 kilometers or 230 miles. The central island itself, the capital maybe, was 5 stades in diameter, so just under a kilometer across.
That's an astonishing level of detail for something meant as fiction, isn't it? What was Atlantis like physically, beyond just its sheer size?
He describes it as consisting mostly of mountains in the northern parts and along the shore, but with that great oblong plain dominating the south. But its end, as the story goes, was dramatic and very swift. It was submerged into the Atlantic Ocean after violent earthquakes and floods. Specifically, Plato says, in a single day and night of misfortune. The result, he claims, was a shoal of mud that made the area impassable, presumably, even in his own time.
Okay, so even if it was fiction, authors often draw from reality, right? What real-world events or ideas might have sparked Plato's very vivid imagination for Atlantis?
That's a question scholars have debated, well, extensively. Plato was known to borrow from older traditions, like the story of Gyges, for example, possible inspirations for Atlantis. Well, there's the Thera eruption. That was a massive volcanic event centuries before Plato, which definitely caused island subsidence and widespread destruction.
Santorini, right.
That's the one. Or perhaps the memory of the Sea People's invasion, or even the Trojan War. These were powerful historical memories floating around. Some also point to more contemporary events Plato would have absolutely known about, like the disastrous Athenian invasion of Sicily back in 415, 413 BC. That was a huge defeat for a powerful naval state.
Ah, echoes of hubris there too.
Definitely. Or maybe the destruction of the city of Helike in 373 BC, which was submerged by an earthquake and tsunami right around Plato's time. There's even a scholar, Rodney Castleton, who suggested parallels between Syracuse, a place where Plato actually had some political ambitions, and his description of Atlantis.
So the origin is rooted in philosophical allegory, maybe inspired by real disasters, yet the myth itself just took on this incredible life of its own. How did ancient writers, and then later modern thinkers, interpret Plato's story? Did everyone just accept it as fiction from the get-go?
Oh, not at all. Ancient writers were quite divided, actually. Aristotle, for instance, Plato's own student, believed his teacher had just invented it purely to teach philosophy. He saw it as a straightforward metaphorical myth.
Okay, makes sense.
But others definitely considered it historical fact. Crantor, who was a student of Plato's student Xenocrates, is often cited as someone who believed it was real. Proclus, a Neoplatonist writing much later in the 5th century AD, reported on Crantor's lost commentary, and he implied Crantor might have even seen hieroglyphs confirming the story in Egypt. Whether that's true or not, who knows?
Tantalizing.
And then later, you get Christian writers like Tertullian believing an isle equal in size to Libya or Asia once existed. Arnobius even blamed its destruction on pagans.
It's amazing how quickly a concept can evolve from like a philosophical tool into something people take as literal historical fact.
Indeed. And Proclus also reported on this other work, Marcellus's Ethiopica, which described 7 islands sacred to Persephone and 3 enormous ones, one of which was a 1,000-stadia island sacred to Poseidon. And these islanders supposedly remembered an immeasurably large island of Atlantis. Yeah, and then way later, in the 6th century, you have Cosmas Indicopleustes even using Atlantis to support his flat earth theory, suggesting Plato borrowed the idea from Moses. So it was already being reinterpreted and repurposed pretty broadly, even in antiquity.
And then came the modern era, where interpretations really started to, well, diverge, didn't they? The story became this wild amalgamation of diverse speculative movements starting around the 16th century.
That's right. That's when scholars, or maybe proto-scholars, began to seriously identify Atlantis with the New World. Figures like Francisco Lopez de Gomara, Sir Francis Bacon, Alexander von Humboldt, they all entertained the idea, at least partially, that Plato might have been referring to America.
Which led to some interesting ideas about ruins.
Exactly. This fueled beliefs that maybe Mayan and Aztec ruins could actually be the remnants of this lost Atlantean civilization.
And that connection really sparked some incredibly influential literature too, didn't it?
It absolutely did. Sir Thomas More's Utopia, which famously coined the term utopia, was directly inspired by both Atlantis and the travelers' accounts coming back from the Americas. It sort of established this link between America and these idealized, sometimes lost, societies. And Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, published around 1623, went even further and explicitly placed his fictional utopia, Bensalem, which echoed Atlantis, somewhere off the coast of America.
But then things took a turn, didn't they? Veered into more, let's say, pseudoscientific theories. Figures like Ignatius L. Donnelly really pushed the idea of Atlantis as a historical reality, completely removed from Plato's original philosophical intent.
Yes, Donnelly is a key figure here. His book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, was hugely popular, and it fundamentally misinterpreted Plato's narrative as actual historical tradition, not allegory. This really fueled widespread pseudoscientific speculation. It sort of opened the floodgates for figures like Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists who incorporated Atlantis into their complex root races theory.
Right, the spiritualist connections started emerging.
And later, you get Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet, who made these startling predictions about Atlantis, its advanced technology, and even its eventual re-emergence. It seems the further we got from Plato's original text, the more people wanted to believe it was a literal lost world.
And what does that tell us maybe about our deep-seated human need for hidden histories, for lost golden ages, even when the evidence points somewhere else entirely? So, okay, after centuries of these varied interpretations, what's the scholarly consensus today? Where do classicists land?
Well, the people who spend their lives poring over ancient languages and texts, the philologists and classical historians, are in overwhelming agreement on the story's fictional nature. There's really very little debate among specialists. Scholars like Julia Annis or A.E. Taylor state pretty unequivocally that Plato's narrative was, quote, an invention of Plato's fancy. It was designed specifically for a philosophical examination of government and power.
A teaching tool, essentially.
Exactly. It was a vehicle for his ideas, not intended as a history lesson.
And modern geology has had a pretty definitive say on the matter, too, right? I mean, essentially closing the door on a physical lost continent actually sinking.
Precisely.
Mm.
The wide acceptance of continental drift and plate tectonics really solidifying in the 1960s scientifically demonstrated the sheer impossibility of a lost continent disappearing in the geologically recent past. Basically, a continent the size Plato described couldn't just vanish without leaving a massive observable geological scar. The Earth simply doesn't work that way, not on that time scale.
Okay. But despite that clear scientific consensus, the search for Atlantis has never really stopped, has it? It feels like dozens of locations have been proposed over the years, and often these suggestions seem completely divorced from the specifics of Plato's account, turning Atlantis into almost a generic concept for just any lost civilization.
That's very true. It's become a kind of catch-all term. Within or near the Mediterranean Sea, Santorini ancient Thera is probably the strongest candidate for Plato's inspiration rather than the actual location of Atlantis itself.
Makes sense.
I mean, it was home to the advanced Minoan civilization. It had a powerful naval empire, contact with dynastic Egypt, all things that echo Plato's description. And crucially, it was famously destroyed by that massive volcanic eruption which caused the island to subside. It's a very dramatic, very Plato-esque event.
And there are other, maybe more unusual geological formations that have been proposed. I've seen pictures of the Rich Hat structure, the Eye of the Sahara. You see those satellite photos, and it just screams lost city, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It makes for a compelling visual, no doubt, and it has captured many imaginations online especially. But geologically, it's understood to be a natural domed erosion structure, not the remains of a submerged concentric city. Other suggestions in or near the Med include Sardinia, proposed by authors like Flavio Barbiero, and the Canary Islands have also been put forward.
So what about the Atlantic, where Plato actually said it was located? The Azores are a popular theory, I think I remember reading.
They are a popular theory, yeah. And it's easy to see why, given their volcanic nature and location out in the Atlantic. However, the geological evidence really contradicts it. Sediment cores taken from the ocean bottom all around the Azores show that the Azores Plateau has been an undersea plateau for millions of years. So while the area is definitely known for its volcanism and seismic events like the Sedades volcano in San Miguel, it just doesn't support the idea of a large landmass suddenly sinking there back in Plato's time frame.
Oh, okay. Moving a bit closer to the Pillars of Hercules, there's been some more recent buzz about southwestern Andalusia in Spain, right? In the marshlands.
Yes, that gained some media attention. Professor Richard Freund claimed back in 2011 to have found possible evidence of Atlantis in the Doñana National Park marshlands. He speculated it was destroyed by a tsunami. However, his claims were pretty swiftly dismissed by Spanish scientists working in the area who called them fanciful and accused him of sensationalizing their actual, more cautious research. Yeah. And Rainer W. Kuhn had put forward a similar theory a bit earlier, based on satellite imagery of the Marismas de Honojos nearby. Even earlier, back in the 1920s, the German archaeologist Adolf Schulten suggested Plato might have used Tartessos, a known ancient city in that region, as a model or basis for his Atlantis myth.
So lots of attempts to pin it down geographically.
Yeah.
And then for those who really let their imaginations run wild, there are some truly far-flung locations that have been proposed, proving just how much people want to find it somewhere, anywhere.
Oh, absolutely. The search goes global. Antarctica has been proposed by some, often linked to theories about pole shifts or ancient mapping. In the Caribbean, you get suggestions pointing to places like an alleged underwater formation off Cuba, or linking it to the mysteries of the Bahamas and the Bermuda Triangle. There are also theories placing Atlantis way out in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, including Indonesia, or the submerged continental shelf called Sundaland. Some even draw parallels with the lost continent Kumari Kondam from ancient Tamil literature. The locations proposed really highlight how Atlantis has become this sort of blank canvas for human projection and desire for lost worlds.
Okay, this brings us to a really crucial question for you, the listener, who's trying to sort fact from fiction. Why do we generally accept the Trojan War as largely real, despite all its mythological elements, but Atlantis is firmly considered a myth. I think a lot of people wonder about that distinction.
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of how history as a discipline works. The acceptance of the Trojan War as largely real again, despite obvious mythological embellishments in Homer, is fundamentally due to tangible archaeological evidence. Heinrich Schliemann's discoveries back in the 19th century, and then much more careful subsequent archaeological work, provided verifiable proof of a historical city of Troy at the right location, with layers showing destruction consistent with a major conflict around the right time.
Okay, so actual stuff found in the ground. But for Atlantis,
For Atlantis, the precise and simple answer is the profound, complete lack of evidence. There is zero archaeological or geological evidence that corroborates Plato's detailed account of a massive lost continent sinking in the Atlantic. Historians, they aren't interested in hiding ancient secrets. Their conclusions have to be based on verifiable evidence. And while, sure, almost anything might be theoretically possible in the universe, history relies on more than just mere possibility. It requires demonstrable evidence. The two cases, Troy and Atlantis, are simply not comparable in terms of empirical support. It's really the difference between finding the ruins of an actual city, however embellished its story became, and finding, well, little or nothing where Plato said Atlantis should be.
that makes perfect sense. So, okay, well, it's not a historical fact. Atlantis certainly hasn't faded away. Its rich cultural legacy continues to inspire across so many different mediums. Let's maybe shift gears and talk about how the myth has been interpreted in arts and culture, because this is where it truly lives on today, isn't it?
Absolutely. In ancient literature, interestingly, even before Plato, there was an earlier writer, Hellanicus of Lesbos, who wrote a poem titled Atlantis. But it was actually about the daughters of Atlas, the Titan, not Plato's lost island. Confusing, I know. And later, the Neoplatonist Zodicus apparently wrote an epic poem based directly on Plato's account, though it's lost. What's really fascinating here is that Plato's work might have even inspired parody almost immediately. There's Theopompus of Chios, writing just a few decades after Plato, whose work Meropis sounds like a possible parody.
A parody? How so?
Well, some scholars suggest it was a humorous exaggeration of Plato's story. It featured men who were twice the normal size in cities with names like Pious Town and Fighting Town. It kind of shows how immediately Plato's ideas began to spark other creative responses, maybe even playful ones.
Huh, okay. And it clearly had a huge impact on utopian and dystopian literature later on, shaping our very concepts of ideal or failed societies.
It really did. Just reaffirming its influence, Francis Bacon's New Atlantis and Thomas More's Utopia are the prime examples everyone knows. Both use that concept of a distant, hidden, perhaps advanced land to explore societal ideals. Later works, like Thomas Herrick's The New Atlantis in 1687 or Albert Armstrong Manship's The Ancient of Atlantis in 1915, continued this theme, often linking the myth to ancient wisdom or highly advanced, isolated societies.
And the story even shows up in modern romantic novels and epic narratives, showing just how flexible it is as a backdrop.
Absolutely. There's a Thai novel, Kalanag, which is a great example of a modern romantic take. It apparently focuses on love, revenge, power, politics, and governance within that flourishing Atlantean civilization right before its collapse. And then in epic verse, you have Frederick Tennyson's Atlantis from 1888. That one features an ancient Greek mariner discovering the remnants of the kingdom and learning about its end from these incredibly long-lived survivors who supposedly went on to found Mediterranean civilizations.
Wow, connecting it all together.
Right. And James Lloyd Dryden's Mona, Queen of the Lost Atlantis from 1925, tells the story through visions, with the queen describing the catastrophe and even touching on spiritualist lore in other lost continents like Hyperborea and Lemuria. It gets pretty expansive.
So it's definitely not just books. Atlantis has made its way into music, painting, sculpture, really capturing the artistic imagination across the board.
It certainly has. In music, you see these profound works like Manuel de Falla's unfinished opera Atlantida or Yanis Ivanov's Symphony No. 4, which is titled Atlantis. Alan Hovhaness wrote a Concerto No. 2 for guitar and strings subtitled Atlantis. The tragedy and the sheer mystery of it lend themselves really well to musical expression.
And visually, in painting and sculpture, what jumps out?
There are some really striking examples. Einar Johnson's sculpture, The King of Atlantis from the early 1920s, depicts this single, powerful figure in a distinctive triangular helmet on a throne, supported by bulls. It really evokes ancient power and mystery. Ivan Maestrovich did a sculpture in 1946 simply titled Atlantis, which seems to symbolize suffering and loss, likely reflecting the post-war era. More recently, there's Luc van Soom's The Man of Atlantis in Brussels from 2003. It's this 4-meter tall figure in a kind of retro diving suit, and the artist explicitly links the myth to modern concerns about climate change. He suggested a future where, quote, a portion of the population will mutate into fish-like creatures to adapt to rising seas.
Whoa, okay, that's a modern twist.
Yeah. And even in conceptual art, you have Robert Smithson's map of broken clear glass, Atlantis, from 1969. He uses the concept in a very abstract way, just showing how pervasive the idea is in our cultural vocabulary.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for us? It seems clear that while Atlantis remains a truly captivating myth, its origins are firmly rooted in Plato's philosophical allegory. It has, however, inspired centuries of speculation, art, and literature, proving its enduring power as an idea rather than as a historical fact.
That's really the key takeaway, isn't it? It's a powerful story, a compelling narrative that continues to resonate deeply, even without a factual basis in history or geology.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. If Plato originally intended Atlantis as a cautionary tale about human hubris, about the dangers of unchecked power, and maybe about the nature of the ideal state, what does our continuing fascination with it and our persistent, often pseudoscientific search for it tell us about ourselves? What does it say about the stories we choose to believe, or perhaps the stories we want to believe?
It truly says far more about human nature, about our hopes, our fears, maybe our yearning for meaning and lost perfection, than it does about the likelihood of finding an actual lost continent beneath the waves.